Sometimes history doesn't turn because of sweeping armies, billion-dollar deals, or global treaties. Sometimes it turns because of a single moment, a decision, a statement, an action made by one person. And in this case, it wasn't just any person. It was an Indian figure whose position, influence, and timing placed them in a spotlight they might not have fully anticipated. One sentence, one decision, one gesture, and suddenly decades of carefully built trust between the United States and India began to unravel. Now, you might think, can a relationship as vast and complex as US-India really be shaken by a single individual? The answer, in political reality, is yes, because relationships between nations are not just about policy, they're about perception. Leaders watch each other not only for what they do, but for what it says about who they are. And when someone from within that circle acts in a way that contradicts the unspoken agreements of respect, alignment, and mutual benefit, it sends a message far louder than any official statement. What made this particular incident so volatile was that it didn't just land in a vacuum. The timing was critical. The US and India were standing at a crossroads, aligning on technology, trade, and defense, while balancing tensions with China and Russia. It was a fragile moment where every move was under a microscope. Into this environment came an action so blunt, so politically charged, that it felt less like a misstep and more like a deliberate signal. Whether or not it was intended that way didn't matter. Perception in diplomacy is often more powerful than fact. The media, of course, magnified it instantly. In Washington, analysts debated whether this was an isolated act of ego or a reflection of a deeper shift in India's political posture. In New Delhi, whispers began about whether the move was a test of American tolerance or an accidental grenade tossed into a delicate room. And here's where the psychology comes in. When a single event triggers doubt, it activates a chain reaction. Once trust is questioned, every small friction afterward feels bigger, sharper, more personal. Think about personal relationships. You can have years of friendship with someone, but one betrayal, even a small one, can plant a seed of suspicion that grows in every future interaction. Nations aren't so different. They have long memories, but even longer grudges when it comes to feeling disrespected. And the United States, for all its diplomatic language, operates on a core expectation. Allies don't surprise each other in ways that embarrass them on the world stage. The most striking part, this individual probably underestimated the ripple effect. They might have thought they were speaking to a domestic audience, or defending a principle, or simply playing to their base. But in an interconnected world, there's no such thing as a local microphone. Every word and action reverberates globally, and when you're in a position of influence, you don't get to control which parts the world hears the loudest. This is why I say it wasn't just the act itself, but the context it landed in. It came at a moment when the US was trying to present India as a strategic partner in shaping the future of the Indo-Pacific. It came at a moment when trade negotiations were balancing on a knife's edge. It came at a moment when both nations needed each other to project unity. And instead of unity, what they got was a fracture, one that may seem small at first glance, but in diplomacy, even hairline cracks can split into canyons. One person, one moment, one choice, that's all it took. And that's the paradox of influence. The higher your platform, the more fragile the balance beneath you becomes. The wrong step doesn't just trip you, it can shake the ground under everyone standing with you. In the end, it wasn't the scale of the act that destroyed trust, it was the symbolism. And in international relations, symbolism is the currency that buys either friendship or resentment. Once it's spent the wrong way, there's no refund. In Washington, silence is rarely neutral. When something this significant happens, the United States doesn't just take note, it takes a position. And in this case, the position came swiftly. From the very start, it was clear that the incident had crossed an invisible but well-known line in diplomatic conduct. America's political machinery is built on both principle and optics, and this event challenged both. You have to understand, in global politics, responses aren't just about the incident itself. They're about the precedent it sets. If Washington had shrugged this off, it would have sent a signal not just to India, but to every ally and rival watching, that the U.S. could be publicly slighted without consequence. That was never going to happen. The American playbook demands that when its credibility is tested, it pushes back, and it does so visibly. The first wave came quietly, private calls, behind the scenes messages, pointed questions to Indian counterparts. But that didn't last long. Soon, it spilled into the public sphere. Key officials gave carefully worded statements. The tone was measured, but the subtext was sharp. We noticed, we don't approve, and we expect a course correction. This is the diplomatic equivalent of a raised eyebrow in a tense conversation, subtle enough to leave room for de-escalation, strong enough to make sure no one mistakes the moment for weakness. Then there's the role of the American media, which is a force multiplier in moments like this. Headlines didn't just report what happened, they framed it. Opinion columns began asking whether India was drifting from the democratic and strategic values it shared with the U.S. Analysts on cable news debated if this was a wake-up call about trusting New Delhi too much. Every segment added fuel to the perception that something deeper was wrong. And remember, perception often becomes reality in foreign policy. What's fascinating here, and what people often miss, is that this wasn't just about anger. It was about protecting relationships with other allies. America has to constantly demonstrate consistency in its partnerships. If it appears to tolerate a breach from one partner, it risks others thinking they can test the limits too. The response, then, was not just to India. It was to the entire global audience that measures U.S. resolve by how it handles moments like these. Behind all of this is a psychological truth that Jefferson Fisher often touches on in a different context. Boundaries mean nothing unless they're enforced. For nations, those boundaries are set by history, treaties, and the unspoken agreements of respect. Once a partner crosses them, you either push back or you silently redefine your own worth in the relationship. And the U.S., for all its internal divisions, understands that in the arena of international politics, silence in the face of disrespect is read as consent. Of course, there were voices urging caution. Some argued that overreacting could push India closer to rival spheres of influence. Others worried that the fallout could harm joint initiatives in defense, technology, and climate. But in the end, the need to reaffirm the rules of engagement outweighed the fear of short-term setbacks. This wasn't just about mending fences. It was about making sure those fences stayed standing, and that's the point. America's reaction wasn't random, and it wasn't purely emotional. It was calculated to remind the world and India that alliances are valuable but conditional. Mutual respect is the currency that keeps them alive. Lose that, and the rest unravels quickly. When trust is tested on the world stage, you either let the moment pass and hope it fades, or you meet it head on and make your position unmistakably clear. The U.S. chose clarity, And in diplomacy, clarity, even when it hurts, is often the only way to keep the relationship from collapsing completely. In New Delhi, the mood was very different from Washington's, but the pressure was just as intense. The Indian government found itself in that impossible space every leader dreads, caught between defending its own and preserving a critical alliance. On one side, there was the individual at the center of the controversy, someone who carried political weight at home and whose words or actions resonated deeply with certain segments of the Indian public. On the other, there was the United States, a partner that India could not afford to alienate without risking long-term strategic and economic costs. This is where the real art of diplomacy is tested. It's easy to take a strong stance when you have nothing to lose. It's infinitely harder when every choice comes with a price tag. If India openly condemned the individual, it risked appearing weak to its own citizens, potentially alienating a voter base that expects the government to stand firm against external pressure. If it defended the person, it risked reinforcing the perception in Washington that India was comfortable with the very act that had triggered the backlash. It's in moments like this that national leadership becomes less about ideology and more about emotional intelligence. In diplomacy, just like in personal relationships, the tone you set in the heat of the moment can determine whether the rift heals or widens. India's leaders had to choose their words with surgical precision, enough to show America they took the matter seriously, but not so much that it looked like they were bowing to foreign demands. Complicating this even further was India's domestic political climate. National pride is a powerful force, and in the age of instant media, even the appearance of giving in can be weaponized by political opponents. The government had to manage not just a conversation with Washington, but also the narrative playing out on Indian news channels and across social media. Every statement was dissected, every pause analyzed, every move framed either as strength or surrender. And here's the deeper truth in international relations. What you say publicly often matters less than what you do privately. New Delhi could signal to Washington behind closed doors that it understood the severity of the situation, even while striking a more defiant tone in public to protect its image at home. It's a balancing act that requires not only strategic thinking, but a clear understanding of how both audiences, foreign and domestic, process information. This is also where the philosophical side of diplomacy comes into play. Nations, like individuals, have identities they guard fiercely. India has long projected itself as a sovereign power that does not take instructions from anyone, and that self-image is part of its political DNA. To maintain that identity while still repairing a damaged relationship takes skill. It means finding a way to acknowledge the harm without compromising the principle. In the end, the Indian government's challenge wasn't just about this one incident. It was about protecting two things at once: its credibility abroad and its legitimacy at home. That's a delicate dance, because overcompensating in either direction can throw the whole relationship off balance. Show too much contrition, and you look dependent. Show too much defiance, and you look unreliable. What New Delhi understood, and what leaders everywhere eventually learn, is that the words you choose in a crisis echo far beyond the moment. They become part of the permanent record, replayed and reinterpreted long after the cameras are gone. And in the high-stakes world of geopolitics, those echoes can shape not just the next negotiation, but the very foundation of trust on which all future cooperation depends. Sometimes the hardest part of leadership is not choosing between right and wrong, but between two rights, both essential, both urgent, and both impossible to fully satisfy at the same time. Fallouts in diplomacy rarely happen with fireworks. More often, They settle in quietly, like a fog that refuses to lift. On the surface, both sides may still shake hands, still smile for the cameras, still issue polite statements about ongoing cooperation. But underneath, something fundamental shifts: trust. And once that shifts, everything else starts to move with it. The incident we've been talking about didn't just create a moment of tension, it planted doubt. That doubt didn't stay confined to the original controversy. It began to seep into other areas of the U.S.-India relationship. Trade negotiations slowed, defense talks became more cautious, and joint initiatives suddenly came with a little more hesitation. It's not that either side wanted to abandon the partnership, but every time they sat at the table, that moment was still in the room with them. Geopolitically, the timing couldn't have been worse. The Indo-Pacific strategy, countering China's influence, building technology corridors, expanding energy cooperation, all of it depends on two things: alignment and reliability. When a crack appears, even a small one, allies start to wonder if they can lean on you when the stakes are higher. And when the U.S. questions whether India will stand firm on shared values, or when India questions whether the U.S. will overreact under pressure, that hesitation becomes a silent partner in every discussion. The economic ripple effects are equally real. Investors watch these moments closely because politics shapes markets. When relations between two major economies become uncertain, decisions about joint ventures, tech collaborations, and infrastructure projects slow down. In a world where speed is often the competitive edge, hesitation is expensive, and that's the part many people miss. The cost of damaged trust isn't always immediate, but it compounds over time. Then there's the long game. Strategic alliances aren't built on agreements alone. They're built on accumulated moments of cooperation. You can spend years building that reservoir of goodwill, but a single fracture can drain it faster than you'd think. The most dangerous part: if the repair process isn't deliberate, the rift becomes normalized. Both sides adjust to a lower level of trust, and that new baseline changes the very nature of the relationship. And here's where the philosophical dimension becomes impossible to ignore. In life, whether personal or political, the hardest fractures to heal are the ones caused by a breach of expectation. We can forgive mistakes, we can work around disagreements, but when we feel that the person or the nation we've relied on isn't quite who we thought they were, it reshapes how we see them. The U.S. thought it knew where India stood. India thought it knew how the U.S. would respond. Both found themselves questioning that assumption. Repair is possible, of course, it always is, but it requires more than words. It requires a series of intentional actions that prove the partnership matters more than the pride wounded in the moment. And until those actions are taken, the shadow of this one incident will stretch over every conversation about trade, security, and shared strategy. The truth is, alliances don't usually collapse in a single day. They erode in moments like this, slowly, subtly, and sometimes invisibly to those not paying attention. The challenge for both Washington and New Delhi now is whether they will see this as a passing storm or as the first sign of a changing climate. Because, in diplomacy, as in life, you can recover from almost anything except the decision to stop trying.